The Lucasian Legacy, the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics at Cambridge University, 1663 to 1993. Robert Bruen, Ph.D., dissertation, Boston College, 1995. Thesis advisor, Professor Edward Power. An important professorship of mathematics was deeded in December 1663 at Cambridge University, England. A member of Parliament for the university, Mr. Henry Lucas, left instructions in his will for the purchase of land valued at £100 to provide an annual income to support this professorship. The Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics is probably the most famous academic chair in the world. As a group, the 17 men who have held the chair have changed the world unlike any other group in history. The 330 years that have passed since its founding have seen the most dramatic evolution of science since time began. The chair represents a microcosm of the world's progress over the last 3 centuries, from the scientific revolution to the world of technology that we know today. It further has a special place in British history, which evolved from a government of a king to a democracy that still maintains a royal family. The holders of the chair have been Barrow, Newton, Whiston, Saunderson, Coulson, Waring, Milner, Woodhouse, Turton, Airy, Babbage, King, Stokes, Larmor, Dirac, Lighthill, and Hawking. Their work has mathematics as the foundation, but their work has spread across many fields. Physics, calculus, astronomy, fluid mechanics, computing, and religion are represented. There are numerous awards distributed, including a Nobel Prize, several knighthoods, and many medals for scientific societies. There have been several of these fields established or greatly improved by a Lucasian professor. This dissertation was born of my interest in the history of higher education. One key component of a college or university is the endowed chair. It allows the person occupying the chair to be free, for the most part, from the usual pressures of academic life. The hope is that this freedom will produce great thoughts and works. Endowed chairs have a long history, but this work is about a particular chair, the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge University, England, established in 1663, which continues today. It is a wonderful example of the success of a donor's investment in higher education. The dissertation is divided into chapters by century. Each century is given a political and scientific context, wherein each professor who held the chair is presented. There is a range of both the quality and quantity of work produced by the professors. Some were stellar producers, and some used the chair merely as a convenient source of income. My research extended from the archives and rare books section of Cambridge University, where I had access to original documents in Latin and seals of the king, to interviews in England in person and by electronic mail. The material has ranged from first editions of books published in the late 1600s to modern film and popular television programs. The academic fields of the professors included mathematics, physics, computer science, fluid mechanics, aerodynamics, and theology. My goal was to present the history of an important chair, since none existed, and to show how, as an endowed academic chair, fits into the history of the development of knowledge and understanding from Isaac Barrow in 1664 to Stephen Hawking in 1993. I express my thanks to my dissertation committee of Professor Pierre Lambert, Professor Ted Yoon, and my advisor, Professor Edward Power. A number of people helped me with this dissertation. I want to thank Jean Flanagan, MIT Lab for Nuclear Science, Dr. Elizabeth Leadham Green, head of the archives at Cambridge University Library, the staff at the Royal Society of London, and the professor, Ronald Probstein, MIT Mechanical Engineering Department. I also wish to thank Sir James Lighthill and Professor Stephen Hawking for being so generous with their time. Introduction: The Lucasian Chair. Whatever nature has in store for mankind, unpleasant as it may be, men must accept, for ignorance is never better than knowledge. Enrico Fermi. An important professorship of mathematics, the Lucasian Chair, was deeded in December of 1663 at Cambridge University, England. Henry Lucas, a member of Parliament for the university from 1639 to 1640, left instructions in his will for the purchase of land with a value that would provide an annual income of £100 to support the professorship. King Charles II signed the letter of acceptance of the deed on January 18, 1664, and Isaac Barrow, the first professor to occupy the chair, took office in February of 1664. He gave the first lecture on March 14th. All undergraduates were required to attend the Lucasian lectures starting in the third year. The Lucasian Chair celebrated its 330th anniversary of its founding, December 1993. The Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics is the most famous academic chair in the world. The current holder, theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, is as well known as any scientist alive. His book, A Brief History of Time, stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for years, rare for scientific works of this nature. He also appeared on a popular television series, appeared on the cover of several non-scientific popular magazines, and has been the subject of a film. The chair was also held by Sir Isaac Newton, who was as well known as anyone else in the history of science. The chair was recently thrust into the public eye in the last episode of the popular television series Star Trek: The Next Generation in May 1994. The series takes place in the 24th century. The episode finds the android character Data appearing as the Lucasian professor in Sir Isaac Newton's home in Cambridge. In a previous episode dealing with time, Stephen Hawking appeared as himself, playing poker with Data, Sir Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein. One can only wonder what Newton and Einstein would have thought about that. What is not commonly known is that the chair has been held by others who represent some of the best and most influential minds in science and technology the world has ever known. This group of 17 men who have held the chair has changed the world unlike any other group in history. The 330 years that have passed since its founding have seen a dramatic evolution in science. Only the future can offer as much in one place. The chair represents a microcosm of the world's progress over the past 3 centuries, from the scientific revolution to the world of technology that we know today. The chair's story began only 30 years after the trial of Galileo, as people began to abandon superstitious beliefs. Sir Isaac Newton, the second holder of the chair, took Galileo's ideas and advanced them to a new level. The century following the publication of Newton's Principia witnessed an explosion of scientific knowledge that continues today. The story of academic chairs is an old one originating in the days of patronage. The earliest chair of mathematics in England was established for geometry at Gresham College by Robert Gresham in 1596. Oxford University has an important chair of geometry founded by Sir Henry Savile, as well as the Savilian Chair in astronomy. Cambridge University has a rich history of chairs, starting with the Lady Margaret Professorship of Divinity founded by the mother of Henry VII in 1502. For an annual salary of just under £14, the professor was required to give public readings of approved theological works 4 days a week. The duties did not change until the mid-1800s, but the salary had increased to about £1,000 by that time. It appears, however, that in practice the number of lectures delivered rarely met the requirement. The excuse was a lack of interest by the students. Professor Herbert Marsh took a bold step in 1809 to improve the situation by delivering his lectures in English. He apologized for using the vulgar tongue, but justified it on the grounds that it was the only way to attract an audience. He was correct in his assessment, setting the standard for all those who followed him. 5 Regius Professorships of Divinity, Greek, Hebrew, Law, and Physic, medicine, not physics, were founded in 1540 by Henry VIII. Each professorship commanded a salary of £40. Civil law and physic were supported by the Crown, the others by the university. Over time, the divinity professorship emerged as the highest status position. King James I annexed the chair to the rectory in Somersham, thereby increasing its financial value. The chair denigrated into a cincture with little scholarly value until Dr. John Kay took office in 1816. He reinstituted the lectures after a century of quiet, just as Herbert Marsh had done for the Lady Margaret Professorship of Divinity. The Lucasian Professorship was the next chair to be endowed at Cambridge University almost 125 years later, in 1663. It was followed in 1704 by the founding of the Plumian Professorship of Astronomy and Experimental Philosophy. The Archdeacon of Rochester, Thomas Plume, left £1,900 for this purpose. The bequest required that an observatory be built along with the housing for the professor. William Whiston, the Lucasian professor that year, sat on the committee that elected Roger Coates, the first Plumian professor. From all accounts, including those of Whiston and Sir Isaac Newton, Coates was a gifted scholar who set high standards for the new chair and his successors. The chair was held in later years by Sir George Airy and Robert Woodhouse, both of whom were also Lucasian professors. The Lucasian chair is one of mathematics, the foundation of science and engineering, and therefore the chair has been the focus of many fields. At the time of its foundation, mathematics was undergoing major changes, with a concentration on the development of calculus. Physics was at the threshold of a revolution under the guiding hand of Sir Isaac Newton. The contributions of Newton were monumental, for even today, 300 years later, his work is still influential. But in the century following Newton, the same level of invention among the men taking the chair was not evident. It is unfortunate that, in spite of the high caliber of the chair holders, all mathematicians concentrating only on mathematics, the expected potential was not achieved. The 19th century saw a rebirth of creativity accompanied by turmoil, and the occupancy of the chair by its least productive holder, Joshua King. In spite of this, several men held the chair who were equal to the task, such as Sir George Airy, an astronomer, not only a mathematician. Later chair holders included Charles Babbage, who virtually created computer science as we know it today, and Sir George Stokes, who worked in fluid mechanics. His contributions to the understanding of fluids were fundamental to the field, and his equations are still used daily in calculations for the design of aircraft and automobiles. Stokes also brought stability to the chair by holding it with distinction over 50 years to the end of the century. The 20th century returned the chair to its original intention of supporting excellence in scholarship with men such as Paul Dirac in quantum mechanics, Sir M. James Lighthill in aeronautics, and Stephen Hawking in cosmology. Although great numbers of prizes, awards, and honors have been bestowed on these men, Dirac is the only one to have received a Nobel Prize. Lucasian professors have been classical scholars, theorists, physicists, computer scientists, astronomers, and fluid mechanists, with the field of mathematics providing the unifying basis for them all. For £100, the world has received quite a bit of knowledge: calculus, gravity, laws of motion, optics, fluid mechanics, quantum mechanics, eyeglasses for astigmatism, the computer, programming languages, and black holes are illustrations. All holders of the chair have been members of the Royal Society except three: William Whiston, Thomas Turton, and Joshua King. Isaac Newton, George Airy, and George Stokes were presidents of the Royal Society. Airy, Stokes, Larmor, and Lighthill were vice presidents, and Stokes, Larmor, and Lighthill were secretaries. Besides Newton, Airy, Stokes, Larmor, and Lighthill were honored with knighthood. The Royal Society recognizes individuals by awarding medals. Its Copley Medal is its highest honor and has been given to Waring, Airy, Stokes, Larmor, and Dirac. The Royal Medal has been given to Airy, Larmor, Dirac. The Rumford Medal has been given to Stokes, and the Hughes Medal to Hawking. Paul Dirac won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1933. Newton, Stokes, and Larmor represented Cambridge University in Parliament. The 17 men that have occupied the chair have advanced knowledge far out of proportion to their number, with entire disciplines in their debt. The chair's participation in the history of science and technology is one of great interest. The development of science and technology is captured in the activities of the men who held it from the scientific revolution to the modern day. Table 1 lists the names, years, and disciplines of the professors who have held the Lucasian chair. Although they all began as mathematicians, several specialized in fields other than mathematics. Still, for those who continued their work after assuming the chair, mathematics provided the foundation of their work. The language of scholars. When the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics was inaugurated at Cambridge University in 1664, the language of scholarship was Latin. Over the years, the use of Latin dwindled, slowly being replaced by vernacular English. The transition is interesting in its own right, but the history of the chair shows how it happened in terms of faculty publications and lectures. In the 17th century, both Isaac Barrow and Isaac Newton, like all traditional scholars, wrote in Latin. Barrow was fluent in both classical Greek and Italian. Newton's great works were written in Latin and were not translated into English until after his death. There was no question which language was to be used at the time. The 18th century was the beginning of the transition, as William Whiston wrote in both English and Latin. Most of his religious works were written in English, while he used both languages for his scientific work. The two subsequent holders of the chair, Nicholas Saunderson and John Colson, wrote in English. Saunderson did not attempt to publish his works, but his book was published posthumously. Perhaps if he had intended publication, he would have written in Latin. Colson not only wrote in English, but translated works into English to make them available to a wider audience. Both men, of course, were trained in Latin. Edward Waring wrote and published his mathematical works in Latin, while Isaac Milner wrote in English. It is clear that this century was the turning point for the Latin-English question, with English eventually becoming more prevalent. The 19th century saw no more publications written in Latin by the Lucasian professors. Milner had been in the chair only 2 years when the new century began and spent 20 of his 22 years in the chair as a citizen of the 19th century. Like those who followed, English was his language of choice. Only the first 1/3 of the chair's history was part of the Latin tradition. Once Milner took the chair in 1798, English was used for publications of scholarly work. In 1823, George Airy presented his oral defense of the bachelor's degree in Latin, although he published his scientific works in English.